Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Looks great.
You can hear me? Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for having me join this group. I really enjoy listening to the conversation, and I have learned a lot over the last couple of days. So today I'm going to talk about the elements of an outdoor recreation economy and everything that goes along with it. This knowledge really is essential for communities that have one or are developing one. Excuse me, I also am fighting a little bit of a cold, so I apologize. Without understanding that economy, communities won't be able to take advantage of the economic diversification opportunity or to mitigate the associated impacts on resources like working lands, wildlife, and water, as well as on people in terms of housing affordability and community character. But before I dive in, just a little bit of background on who I am and who Headwaters Economics is. We are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit research group. We are based in Montana, but we work across the US. And our aim is to improve community development and land management decisions by working with partners to provide data and research and information to help those places make well-informed decisions about some of the biggest issues they face related to socioeconomic change and land use, like managing outdoor recreation, mitigating climate-related disasters like wildfire and flooding, and equity and economic development. And I'm an economist at Headwaters Economics, and I lead our research on public lands and outdoor recreation. So my presentation today is divided into three parts. First, I'll talk about what is an outdoor recreation economy. Then I'll talk about some specifics, outdoor recreation economics in Montana. I apologize to all the Canadian members of our audience. I don't have parallel stats for Canada, but I think a lot of the trends that we all talk about in Montana are consistent in Canada. And then finally, I'll talk about the choices that communities have when they're trying to manage the impacts of recreation in their town. So first, if you come away with nothing else from this presentation, I want you to remember that an outdoor recreation economy is about more than just tourism. So tourism is an essential part, but like this settler shows, recreation can support long-term economic development. Excuse me. So this is a roadmap of kind of how we think about an outdoor recreation economy holistically. And I'm going to zero in on each of these pieces. So first, as I mentioned, tourism really is kind of the initial kernel, but it is more than that. You know, visitors come, they spend money on restaurants, on guiding services, hotels, and gear, and then that money continues through the economy to support many other sectors. And we think of really tourism as a marketing strategy, bringing new residents who first were tourists, as outdoor recreation helps to recruit new businesses, and then it helps those new businesses in turn recruit those skilled employees to work in those businesses. And we really start to see a snowballing effect. Now I want to talk about something called non-labor income, which sounds really wonky and technical, but it really just refers to income that people earn not related to the job that they're working in right now. So it can be retirement income, it's investment income. And we know in a lot of communities, especially rural places, it's more than half of the income in a community. So it's kind of hidden and it's easy to overlook, but it's really powerful and has a lot of influence on the local economy, because that income supports sectors across the economy, especially construction and healthcare and professional services like architects and engineers. And we know that retirees move to places with more public lands at a higher rate than to places without. And so we see this time and again that it's those public lands amenities that attract this income. And then all of the above supports local tax revenue that helps to provide essential public services like schools and roads and libraries. But outdoor recreation obviously is not just about visitors. Most importantly, it supports that high quality of life for people who live there presently. Research has found measurable mental and physical health benefits for those who have access to the outdoors. with the biggest gains among the elderly and low-income residents, who are often the hardest folks to reach with typical public health interventions. And we know that investments in trails and pathways gets residents active, and that these investments tend to be less expensive and more effective than other public health interventions. Next, we know that outdoor recreation provides a terrific test lab for gear manufacturers who are doing their research and design, and also helps them to build that authentic brand so that those things are, their stuff is rooted in an experience. And then all of the above supports Main Street businesses, helping to keep communities vibrant for residents who live there already, as well as for visitors. And then finally, we know that outdoor recreation attracts new residents. And this was especially true during COVID as people moved to smaller towns and rural places. And we see many communities that have been able to use tourism as a way to market their community, to recruit those new residents, the entrepreneurs, and that talented workforce and retirees. But I think it's important to pause here and to talk about what a recreation economy is not. It's not unilateral. So a recreation economy can coexist with other sectors in extractive sectors in natural resources. It can coexist with forestry, oil and gas, can coexist with agriculture. And there are examples throughout the West of communities that have used recreation to help to even out that cyclical nature of these resource-based economies. We also know that it's not a silver bullet. Recreation is not going to fix all of a community's woes, but it can help contribute to that overall economic development strategy by helping to diversify, remembering back to those recruiting businesses and entrepreneurs. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some economic indicators for recreation communities and trends in Montana. Where we know, so those places that are classified as recreation dependent, it's about a third of counties in Montana, but we know that outdoor rec really is alive and well in every corner of the state, even if they're not technically categorized as dependent on recreation. And so the first indicator I want to talk about is migration. We know that recreation economies bring more people to a community. So on this chart, the green bars show those recreation dependent places. The blue bars show the non-recreation dependent places. And the set on the left looks at Montana, and the set on the right is the West. And we can see that what's happening in Montana is really true what's happening across the West. And this is net migration since between 2010 and 2019. And we can see that recreation places have, on average, brought in a lot of people. And non-recreation places have even lost people on average, at least in Montana. And so the impacts of this migration, it means that a community's schools and libraries and grocery stores can stay open. But we have to recognize the impacts on the landscape and on the culture of the community that needs to be managed. We also know that wages on average are lower in recreation dependent places, because there is still a larger share of lower wage service jobs. And there are fewer jobs in those higher paying timber manufacturing sectors. And finally, we do know that also that recreation communities tend to be expensive because on average, mortgages and rents are higher. And this is compounded by the fact that on average, we see lower earnings per job, even though we've seen faster growth in those earnings, but that growth hasn't been enough to keep pace with the growth in housing prices. So to summarize the economic performance, on the pros, we see higher migration and growing wealth that helps to support a more diversified economy to weather cyclical booms and busts. But on the other side, we also see lower earnings, higher cost of living, resource impacts, and impacts on community character. But many of these cons can be mitigated with planning and partnerships that I'm going to talk about in the next section. So we know that growth changes communities, right? This traffic jam is an image from going to the Sun Road. I'm sure many people on this call have seen something similar to this when traveling through our national parks. We know that amenity-rich places are going to grow, and the communities and the landscapes and the resources are going to be affected. But communities do have a choice of what to do when they're faced with this change. So I think of this as the choose your own adventure opportunity. You can wait and see, hoping that maybe this will die down, maybe it's just a blip, maybe this was just COVID, and with few active policies or plans. We also see some communities that really react, and they attempt to stop growth and prevent it from happening, which, spoiler alert, isn't possible. It just makes your community really unattainably expensive. And then finally, the choice I'm going to emphasize today and talk a little bit about is communities can plan and anticipate and direct that growth and make it work for them. So there are kind of 5 policy opportunities, and I'm going to go through them quickly today, but I just want to touch on them because they're all really important, but some I think get overlooked. So the first are fiscal policies. And I know that this sounds like the most boring and uninteresting topic, but I cannot overstate the importance of fiscal policy because communities need adequate funding that capitalizes on that influx of visitors so that residents aren't bearing the entire burden of the costs of providing services and creating these programs. And we do face challenges. For example, in Montana, most communities are unable to tax visitors' spending. So residents have to pay for the services, the improvements in roads, things like that, through income taxes and property taxes. And we think we can do better. The next part I want to talk about is housing, which is front of mind for so many communities right now. And places need to be proactive to promote policies that put the right housing in the right places. And communities really need the latitude to pursue the kinds of policies that work in their town. And places that are being successful really are leaning on a whole toolkit, combination of incentives, regulations, zoning policies, permit streamlining, partnerships with nonprofits and builders. So a lot of really creative solutions that people are trying, like really honestly throwing spaghetti at the wall and trying everything. There's no one single policy that will solve the housing challenges communities are facing. But it's important to remember that market forces alone, sort of remember that wait and see option. So just relying on the market, it's not going to provide sufficient housing for the entire income spectrum, at least on a time scale that meets the demand that we're seeing today. The next aspect I want to talk about is infrastructure, which also sounds really boring, but we need to think about how does a community with 5,000 people provide the drinking water, the wastewater treatment, and adequate roads to service, say, 5 million visitors. And big projects really take time to implement, and those big projects might be needed sooner than we realize as growth starts accelerating. So communities need to plan for a way to fund these expansions and upgrades so that these investments don't fall entirely on residents. Next is the recreation infrastructure itself. So we know that our trailheads and trails are going to face pressure as more visitors come. And communities will be well served to measure how much use is happening today, to identify those places that we think of they're full, and direct visitors toward areas that can accommodate them and can support that increased use. And again, plan for those infrastructure upgrades like trailhead expansions and trail improvements. And for those places close to town, if we can think about transportation planning, is there a way to get people there in ways other than single-use cars? And then finally, last but definitely not least, are the ecological resources. So some places are going to need greater protections from sprawl and from too much recreation. And this is far easier to do before growth than after growth has already overrun a place. And so this, as with all of the above things I've talked about, all ties back to that fiscal policy that ensures that the funding mechanisms are in place to support the planning and the projects that are necessary. And so hopefully, I asked you to remember one thing, but hopefully you can remember three. So the first is that outdoor recreation is more than just tourism. It's really a chance to think about diversifying an economy. And then we know that outdoor recreation is alive and well in the Crown, even if many places aren't technically dependent. It's because they have other things that are also supporting the economy, like timber and ag. And it's a great opportunity for diversification. And then finally, we know that outdoor recreation will happen, especially in a place so rich in public lands and natural resources. But to build an economy around it that improves the community's resilience, it really does take planning and intention. It's not going to happen by accident. And that's all I have for today. My contact info is here if you have any questions or want to follow up.
Thanks so much, Megan. I think we do have a few minutes for some questions. I'm going to start with one in the chat, and then if anybody else has a question, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. So in the chat, Jacqueline asks, how can we create more opportunities for public transportation and bike travel throughout the Crown when many communities don't politically support these options?
Yes, there are definitely some political headwinds. For sure. Thank you for raising the elephant in the room. Well, you know, I think a lot of this is a matter of framing, and it might be difficult to initially make the case for this, for those transportation opportunities. But I think if we can, again, build those revenue streams so that they're being supported directly by the visitors, is one way to do this, and to think about community priorities, you know, to really pitch this as a way to help support the community where it is right now. You know, so many places are, you know, change is a scary thing and it's really difficult in communities. But I think doing this transportation planning and thinking about other ways to reach trailheads, pitching that as a way to keep our trailheads less busy, you know, framing it in that way, I think can be one strategy.
For sure. For sure. Thanks, Megan. Does anybody else have another question for Megan? I'm just reading in the chat here. The chat comes so fast, so it's hard to keep up, everyone.
There's a question from Amy there, Holly.
Okay, let's see. So Amy says, as recreation and equal access is so important for health, physical and mental health, are there opportunities to tap into health budgets?
Yeah, and that's where I think there's some really exciting opportunities for creative partnerships. And that's working with public health organizations, working with foundations that typically fund public health interventions, are getting more and more interested in these social opportunities and equity, and thinking about access to outdoor recreation. So they're getting more involved. And I think that's a great way to expand the umbrella of stakeholders who are interested in this, and bringing, you know, hospitals are always looking for ways to, you know, build goodwill in the community, and they're great, can be a really great ally and a non-traditional ally, especially if you're trying to build support with elected officials. So I think the public health entities are a great opportunity.